something that I've been following for a long time and have explained, and I want to just explain this in detail here, because I recently listened to a podcast between two revolutionary anarchists, so left-wing anarchists, discussing the value of violence in the anarchist movement. One was a healthcare worker, and the other one is a teacher, just to give you a little bit of background on their perspective. And again, when I say anarchist violence, I'm not talking about Edward Abbey and the guy who runs a homestead and doesn't pay his taxes. I'm talking about the left-wing anarchists who literally just want to overthrow the government. They're capable and willing to commit acts of violence and terrorism. They're anti-capitalist. They're anti-American. They're essentially anti-everything that we would stand for. That's who I'm talking about when I talk about anarchist violence. The two anarchists on this podcast said that they support insurrectionary violence that is deliberate and directed against the state. They also provided a pretty interesting quote here from Carlo Cafiero, who is a 19th century anarchist. And he said, quote, "Our action must be permanent rebellion by word, by writing, by dagger, by gun, by dynamite, sometimes even by ballot." He goes on, "We are consistent, and we shall use every weapon which can be used for rebellion. Everything is right for us, which is not legal." And finally, he continues, "Friends, if we go on waiting until we are strong enough before attacking, we shall never attack. It is precisely revolutionary action which develops our strength, just as exercise develops the strength of our muscles." And I'm almost certain that Lenin said something very similar to that as well, but action being contagious. One of the anarchists here also pointed out that the movement has, quote unquote, no momentum today. And this is a continuation of, I've seen a lot of that sentiment in these revolutionary anarchist channels. This particular guy said that he doubts that the revolutionary anarchist movement can get back to the fervor of 2020. I've also seen multiple people say that. And he explains this is because the movement is much less appealing for the average person. He also believes that there's a very low likelihood of revolutionary success. And he adds that he says it's demoralizing to hold these aspirational goals of revolutionary anarchism, but remain powerless to achieve them. And I want to explain something here. Why did the revolutionary anarchist movement go from being nationally strong in 2020, I mean, causing real problems for the Trump administration / the federal government, to being so weak that, I mean, they can't even organize a riot right now? And I want to explain this to you. And we look at this summary of insurgent phases here. This is the phases of insurgency warfare. The organizing phase, which is mostly clandestine. Most of this happens without any overt indication. And just generally, here's what happens. The political movement is being built. They're developing these revolutionary cadre, basically the leaders of the revolution. They're propagandizing, they're recruiting, they're seeding themselves into other organizations and trying to co-opt those organizations into the revolutionary movement. They're infiltrating key positions of government, getting ready to launch this insurgency. And once they have, historically, what are called cleavages. Once they have exploited the cleavages of these societies, basically once they have these wedges in society, and they're trying to wedge off and disintegrate parts of society so that they can be agitated and co-opted for the insurgency, then they move to the guerrilla phase. And so that's low-level armed violence. This is really critical here. A lot of people talk about insurgency. An insurgency is not one until it's an armed attempt to overthrow a government. That is the DoD textbook definition of insurgency, Department of Defense, DoD. But we see stuff like raids and ambushes, attacking state infrastructure, sabotage, and terrorism. One of the big goals of this in the guerrilla phase is to build strategic bases of support. Build areas that are impenetrable by the state security or the government security or military forces. I think Portland was a really good example of that. It was definitely one of the very few strategic basis that the violent anarchist movement had for a couple of reasons. I'll talk about it later. And then they want to gain the initiative in this guerrilla phase. So they want to be able to plan attacks and force the government to respond to them, as opposed to being merely responding to what the government's doing. And then they announce a new government. And we did not get to that point in 2020. But I do think, if we just look at this right here, 2020 was a very classic case of what I would call a proto-insurgency. I think it was actually an attempted popular revolution, because from 2015 to 2020, we saw undeniable indicators of the organization phase of insurgency. We saw the networks being built online and in person. We saw the development of international support and solidarity with this movement. We saw infiltration into key government positions, which happened prior to Trump even assuming the presidency. We saw lots of propaganda and recruitment into this so-called anti-fascist movement. And that was I think, predominantly the vehicle. There's BLM, which was a social movement. And then you had the anti-fascist movement, which really, I think, was effectively political warfare. And then in 2020, that was the attempted popular revolution. And that is exactly what we saw in 2020. It ended by the end of 2020, early 2021, only because the 2020 election was called for Biden. The revolutionary anarchist movement was not organic. I think it was real, but it was not organic, because I really do think they were just the useful idiots that were being used to gin up national opposition to Trump. And that was unleashed alongside political warfare that happened in the courts and the judiciary and Congress and elsewhere against Trump. The key goal of counterinsurgency is rolling back these phases. So if you have an insurgency that is developed into the mobile phase, and let me go ahead and describe mobile phase here. So once an insurgency is conducting these guerrilla attacks, they're gaining support for their new government. Remember, they're trying to topple the existing government and install their own. They're going to start kicking government forces out of these areas. And so what happens? Well, you've got to have a new political system. You've got to have a new government that governs these areas. And in the Taliban, for instance, in the Afghan insurgency, they had the shadow government. There were Taliban judges, there were Taliban district governors and Taliban provincial governors. They were building a parallel government, a shadow government that effectively controlled probably most of Afghanistan realistically. It was so bad that when there were disputes in villages, the Afghans stopped going to the government of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. They didn't go to the U.S. They went to the Taliban. They went to the Taliban's judges and said, hey, will you mediate this dispute for us? We saw the same thing, AQI, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. We saw a lot of that as well. The Supreme Council of the Islamic Republic of Iraq, SCIRI, that was the Iranian-backed version in Iraq. It was the Shia version. And so once the guerrilla starts having some success, they start to control territory. And then that is when they move into mobile warfare. This is conventional warfare. This is when a guerrilla movement has strengthened, and they've taken so much resources from the government. They've taken so much assets from the government. They didn't start out with tanks, but they will capture tanks. And when they've actually captured the personnel and the resources and the means to have conventional warfare, they do. And this is when we get to mobile warfare. And so they're gaining and consolidating territory. They're establishing political military dominance. They've declared the new government. They've shifted to conventional warfare. They've deepened their guerrilla attacks, for instance, into the capital region in a lot of cases. Like you look at the fall of Vietnam, that happened right at the end. Or, well, the deepening of guerrilla attacks was ongoing, but especially in the capital, that was the last place to fall. Neutralize any kind of internal or reactionary opposition, and then finally declare victory. And so the whole goal, if you're a counterinsurgent, the whole goal is to take an insurgency in the mobile warfare phase and weaken it and push it back to the guerrilla phase. You're trying to weaken the conventional military strength and push them back into predominantly guerrilla attacks, because that's much less of a threat than having a division, an armored division, sitting right outside the Capitol. And then you want to take the guerrilla phase and then weaken it and push them back to the organization phase. You're trying to roll back these phases. And that's exactly what we saw in late 2020 and into 2021. The guerrilla phase of the proto-insurgency or the attempted popular revolution was rolled back to the organization phase. And we saw that because the systems that supported the guerrilla phase, the finance, the political cover, the cover from government, the popular support that was ginned up, all that stuff was turned off by early 2001, and that effectively defeated the revolutionary anarchist movement. It's really not that they were defeated, as we would call it. It's that they were undercut because they were no longer useful. This was never organic. It was only real in the sense that it existed for a single purpose, and that was to build political and social pressure against the Trump administration. This is the whole part of the attempted popular revolution. This is street level action against Trump supporters and the Trump administration. I think this is the only explanation for how a revolutionary anarchist movement goes from strong enough to literally siege a federal courthouse in Portland for 100 days or something like that, to now the point is to the point of now they can't even roll out black bloc. They can't even foment a riot in some of these cities. So I just want to start out today's show by explaining a little bit of history, and in this week I'm going to spend a lot of time on looking at is there going to be some kind of repeat if Trump wins in November? Is there going to be some kind of repeat of 2020? What's going to happen to this group? Because they're incredibly weakened to the point of their podcasting about how demoralized they are because they are not going to meet their goals.